Hello, AboveLine. My name is Ryan Shen, and I've been given this instructions to complete the junior developer React test so that I could move on to the next level. So Patrick has sent me this React test instructions, and I'm just gonna jump right into it. So I'm just gonna do the steps one by one, and hopefully show you my code, show my thinking process, and also show you why I've done certain things in terms of design and logic. And so in the end product is supposed to be looking as close to this. And so I'm gonna get it looking like this as close as possible. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. So I'm gonna open my terminal, and then desktop. I'm gonna do create React app, and I'm gonna call this above line React test. And I'm just gonna let this run, and it's gonna take a while, but yeah, so we're just gonna wait right in here. Just a disclaimer: if you hear any background music, it's my family who's watching TV in the living room, so please bear with me. And yeah, I'm just gonna wait for this to finish. Awesome, it's done now. So I'm just gonna cd into the directory. So cd react above, excuse me, above line react test, and then check its directories. Cool. So now I'm just gonna open Visual Studio Code. And I got all the files I needed right here, so that's awesome. So I'm just gonna open terminal inside here, and it seems like I got some uncommitted changes that I need to upload into my GitHub. And keep in mind, this repo will be uploaded into my GitHub at github.com/Ryan Cheng Yoshin, and so I'll be giving you the link below. So I'm gonna commit these changes. So git add everything, git status, and git commit, and then I'm just gonna say initialized create React app. Awesome. So now, before I begin writing code, I just want to say, like, in terms of CSS design, I really like to have Webpack break my CSS files into modules. And so how I'm going to make that work is I need access to the Webpack config files. And in order to do that, in package.json, it gives me an npm script that allows me to eject from it. And so I'm going to run that right now, npm run eject. Yes, make this permanent. Awesome. And so the reason why I committed those changes onto GitHub is because if you were to run npm run eject without committing those changes, it's not going to allow you to do that, and it won't eject all the files and all the config files and stuff like that. And so that's why I decided to commit the changes. So now that's done, I now have all the access to the Webpack files. We got Webpack config dev and Webpack config prod. And so how I'm gonna make my CSS classes module is by going to first Webpack config dev file. I'm just gonna close package.json and go all the way down to the part where it mentions CSS styling, which should be around here. And so inside the options, I'm just gonna add in these couple of properties. So module and make modules, and make that equal to true. And then also make the local ident name and give it a script where I take the name underscore underscore local underscore underscore hash colon base 64 semicolon 5 and then close. And now what this allows Webpack to do is basically when you have a CSS file, it allows you to import it as a module. And so that'll just make things easier for me to input CSS code into my React components. And again, this is completely optional, but this is what I prefer to do things in terms of styling when I have complete freedom. And so I'm just gonna take this part and also copy it into Webpack config prod all the way down to the part where it mentions CSS styling. Under options right here. And I'm just gonna paste that in there. And cool. So now we set up Webpack to make CSS modules. And so I'm just gonna code this. And then I'm just gonna run npm run start just to see if it will load onto my browser. Awesome. So now it's rendered into my browser, and obviously right now all the styling is completely gone because now that Webpack now configures styling to be in modules. So I'm just gonna make those changes right now. So I'm gonna close the config, go into source, app.js, and this is where all of the React components you see on the browser just now. And so I'm just going to delete everything. And same thing goes for the CSS. So delete that. And now before I start writing components, I quickly just want to give a brief run through of what I'm going to, how I'm going to separate out the components into views. So if you were to go back into the end product, which is right here, in my opinion, I see approximately 4 components that I should write. So I should write the overall app container, which is this whole view right here. And also inside the app container, we're going to provide a header. And then we're going to have one component that takes all the squares right here, and including the login form right here. So that's one component. Well, app container is 1, squares is 2, and then each individual square, that's another component itself, so that's 3. And then the fourth and final component will be this login form right here, which would be nested inside the squares component. And so I'm just going to go back to my Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to quit out of npm run start, and I'm going to start creating these components. And how I like to separate out, provide the workflow of the folders itself is that I like to separate it out between containers and components. And so I'm going to create a directory called containers. Whoops. Before I do that, I got to move into source. So cd source. Awesome. And then make the directory called containers, and also make a directory called components. And then, so inside, as we mentioned before, there's going to be the app container, the squares component, since we're not going to be manipulating state or having any React lifecycle hooks, and also the square component, which would also be a component itself, and we're not going to be manipulating state. And for the login form, we're going to be making that into a container, since it will involve state manipulation and other things. And so going back inside the containers folder, I'm going to create a file called login.js, so containers login.js, and also one for login.css. Cool. And inside the components folder, I am going to make a folder inside components called squares. Whoops, misspelled that. Cool. And inside the squares directory, I'm also gonna create a folder called squares. Awesome. And inside the squares directory, we're just going to do it exactly how we did inside the containers folder. So we're going to create a file called components squares, and inside squares, squares.js, squares.css. So we got the files right there, and we're going to do the same things for the square components. So touch components squares, square.js, and square.css. Awesome. So now we got all the components we need right here, and we're gonna be starting writing code. And just to start off, we're gonna start in the app container where we're gonna be rendering the squares component and also the header right here. So just to start off, I'm going to be providing an h1 tag. Actually, first, provide a div. And whoops, I forgot to change this to React. So div. Inside the div, I'm going to provide an h1 tag that says AboveLine Junior Developer React Test, which I think that's the name. Oh, sorry, Junior Developer Test. And then inside the h1 tag, we're going to be rendering the squares component. And now squares hasn't been completely made yet, but what we can do is import it. So going to get rid of all this stuff right here. And import squares from, and it's inside the squares directory. So we're probably going to be in the current directory. Oh, yeah, current directory, components, squares. Save that. And now we're just going to be giving this a little bit of styling. And remember how I mentioned that I made CSS files into modules now? So that's what you're going to be seeing here right now. So in app, I'm going to create an app class. And just keep in mind, I'm providing bare CSS styling and without using any design framework. So I'm going to provide as much responsive styling as possible. So I'm going to keep the units very consistent as much as possible. So I'm going to provide margin of, I think, around 3% for top and bottom, and another 3% for left and right. And the reason why I did that is so that if you look at it here, you see a little bit of spacing between the headlines right here. And I just want to provide a little bit of spacing, which I can do with margin. And I'm also going to provide the styling for this header right here. So I'm just going to call this app title. And I'm going to provide a font size of, make it 1.5 EM. And then as you can see, there's a little bit of margin right here. So I'm going to do that as well. So margin bottom. And then I'm going to make this 5%. And now how I'm going to import the classes is by saying import classes from /app.css, and I'm going to give the styles here. So class name. So now all of the styling is class based, and so classes dot app, which is the app class, and for the header, class name classes dot app title. So I'm just gonna delete squares for now just to see if I've done this correctly. So npm run start. And it takes a while to load this. Just give it a moment. And cool. So now we got this thing to render, which is the title, and it has a little bit of spacing here, so it's doing as it was supposed to do. And so going back, now, as I mentioned, I provide the squares, and if I were to save it, nothing's going to show, and it's going to throw me an error. And so I'm going to go to the squares component now, and I'm going to create a component for this. So import React from React, and then I am going to create a component called squares, which is going to have the props parameter, which we don't really need, and return some JSX. And then we're also going to export default squares. And now if you were to look at the final product, inside squares, it's going to have multiple, well, approximately 4 red squares. And so rather than just duplicating 4 divs, why don't we just create a square component and then we map it. And so what I'm going to do here is take an array that takes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And since this is JSX, we have to wrap this around with curly braces and probably provide a div as well. And for some reason Visual Studio keeps switching over to regular JavaScript. Awesome. And then inside this curly brace, we're going to map it. And then it's going to provide a key, and it's going to return the square component, which we haven't really made yet, which we will later on. And so when you map an array and then provide JSX, we do have to provide a key. And so with key, we want to make that into this key parameter right here. And so now that's done, we have to import square component. So square from, it's going to be in the square component, and then square. So now that's done, if we were to go back, it's still going to throw an error because since we haven't made the square component. And so we have to provide that. So inside square.js, we're going to start making this component. So import React from React, const square, which takes the props, which we don't really need, and then return some JSX, which is probably going to just be a regular div. And forgive me. And then we're going to export default square. So now that we made the square, we can now import it into here. But before we do that, we're going to have to style the squares itself. So inside square.css, we're going to be providing some styling. So I'm going to create the square class, which is probably going to be an inline block since we don't want each div to be stacked on top of each other. So we're going to set the display to inline block. And then one cool thing about this one application is that I have this thing called color note, which allows me to get the coloring of all the elements inside the browser. And so to make the accurate color of this color right here, I'm just going to take the color note and I am going to copy this and then set the background color to that. And then it seems like all the squares right here has like this very small black border, so I'm going to provide the border as 1 pixel solid black. And then give it a width of approximately, let's say, 40%. And then now we have to give it a fixed height, and I'm just going to say 300, I'll say approximately 400 pixels, just to be sure. And then we're going to provide the margin since there's going to be spacing between each other right here. And so I'm going to set margin equal to, I'll say, roughly 3%. And then hopefully that should provide a 2x2. And it's because width is set to 40%, so approximately 2 squares can fit in 1 row. And so hopefully that would work. And then going back to square.js, I'm going to import the classes from the styling. So square.css. And then I'm going to set the class name to those styles. So classes dot square. And so let's try if we can see this on the web browser. And cool. Now obviously if you look at this page right now, I feel like the spacing and then the squares itself is a little too big, so I'm just going to change the styling there. So instead of 400, I'm just going to say maybe 350. And then change the margin for that to maybe 1%. So if I were to go back, okay, the spacing now is much better. But I feel like the squares can be shrunk, so I'm just going to say 300. So yes, that's much better now. And so now what I'm going to do is going back to the instructions. As you can see, there's a little bit of margin spacing between the browser and the squares component. And so that's what I'm going to provide here. So I'm going to start providing the styling for the squares component. So I'm going to make the squares class, which first and foremost, I'm going to make this position relative. And the reason why I'm going to make this position relative is because if you look at the login form right here, it's position that's overlapping the squares component. And so by making the position relative and making the login form position absolute, we can take it out of the normal flow and place it relative to the squares component and then manipulate the spacing and the position. And so that's why I place the position relative for the squares. And then I'm going to provide a margin so that it shows spacing between here. And I'm going to say it's going to have a 0% margin top to bottom and approximately, I'll say 10%. And then now the squares component is going to have a width and a height of 100%, so it takes up all the spacing. So width 100%, height 100%. And so now we're going to import the classes here. So import classes from squares.css. And I'm going to provide it the classes here. So class name, squares. Now that the styling is provided, we can now go check it out in the browser. And I feel like the spacing is a little bit too much here, so I'm just going to shrink that a little bit and change it from 10% to maybe 7. Okay, I could bear with that. So we provided spacing here as we did it, as you saw right here. And so now we got the 4 squares right here along with the title. And now the only thing that's missing is the login form, which we provided the files inside the containers. And so I'm gonna go close all of these except for the squares component. Open up the login.js, and now I mentioned before that the login is going to be manipulating state and having properties inside classes, and so I'm going to make this into a container. So import React, comma, curly braces component from React, and then we're going to have a class called login extends component. And then we're going to render, which is going to return some JSX. And then we're going to export default login. And as you can see from the instructions, the login form seems to have a div that contains a form right here. But I'm just going to have the form tag itself, so let me just switch this to React. So form doesn't have any actions, and then 2 inputs. So input, and then a button. Which is going to say login. So login, and then the input types are going to be username and password. So type for here is going to be text, name, username, and then for here we're going to provide type password. Close this, type password, name is also password. And since Create React app is using React version 16, I'm just going to provide the states here. So state, and the states that we're going to be manipulating inside this container is going to be username. We're going to set that to null, and password, which is also going to be set to null. And then, so the idea here is that we're going to have to change the state so that whatever the user inputs inside here, we want to change it for the state. And so we're going to provide an onChange property for both, which is going to have a handler that's going to say this dot onChange handler. Same thing goes for here. And then now what we need to do is provide functionality for this onChange handler. So we're going to declare an onChange handler function here, which is going to take an event as an argument. And then now what we need to do is we need to change the state every time the user changes the inputs here. And so we're going to do this dot set state. And And then whatever the user changes, which is going to be event.target name, which we declared it right here. And we're going to set that property to event.target.value, which is going to be the value that the user provides into these inputs. And so now, one thing we're forgetting is that now the login component has been made, we also have to input that inside of the squares component, because the squares component is where it's being held behind this login form. So I'm going to go to the squares. I'm going to first import it. Import login from, and it's inside the container, so we have to go up one directory. So containers. Whoops, another directory. So containers, login. And then we're going to place the login right here. Now if you were to save it, it should now render the squares component along with the login form, which it shows right here. And I know it's pretty ugly, but we're going to be changing that pretty soon. And so now we're going to be manipulating the CSS so that this login form will now be overlapping the squares component, just like how it is done here. And so I'm going to go to login CSS, create a login class. And remember how we made the squares component position relative, and now we can make the position for here absolute. That way it will allow the login component to be taken out of the normal flow and be positioned relative to the squares component. And so now I'm just going to position absolute, maybe make the top, maybe I'll say 40%, or no, 30%. And then the left 20%, just to be approximate. We'll be changing and adjusting as we go further on. And then we're going to be setting the width to approximately, say, 50%. Height, I'll say roughly 25%. And then seems like there's a border right here, a black border, so I'm just going to say border 1 pixel solid black. And then I'm also going to make the background color white. And then there seems to be a lot of padding, the space between the content and the border itself. And so I'm going to provide some padding. And I'll say 10%. And then now I have to import the CSS classes here. And then put into the form. Oh, excuse me. And so I'm going to save that. And now the login form should now be overlapping with the squares component. So if I were to go back, and boom, now we got it to overlap with each other. But now it's just, we have to now adjust the positioning. And so seems like if I were to go back, seems like I placed it a little bit too far down, a little bit too far to the left, and made it, probably make it a little bit too big. And so I'm just going to be changing the top and probably say, I'll probably say 26% or 25. I'll say 26. And then I'm going to change the left and say 15%. Change this to 45. And the padding is a little bit too much, so I'm going to probably say 7%. That looks much better. And now it seems like there's a little bit left here, so let me change that a little bit. So probably say 12. Perfect. And now we got the login form to be completely centered right here. But if you were to go back to instructions, now the inputs and the login button, they're stacked on top of each other, making it a block level element. But since inputs are inline elements, we're going to have to provide that styling and the display inside the CSS file. And so I'm going to create an input class. I'm going to set the display to block so that it stacks on top of each other. And we're also going to make the width a little bit bigger as it looks right here. And then it seems like there's a little bit of padding right here, so I'm gonna say padding, give it a top and bottom of 2%, and then left to right 1%. And then now we're gonna have to put this in the center in this form, and so we're gonna make the margin have a top to bottom of 2% and make it auto so that it centers it right here. So if I were to save this, seems like it's still not showing, which is fine. So I'm gonna make changes to this block login right here. Oh, I know why. My mistake. I forgot to input the classes into the inputs. So I'm just gonna be breaking this up into new lines. Provide a class name. Do the same for the password. Classes.input. Now if we were to save this now, it should be showing the styles for the inputs. And so if I were to go back, and boom, now it shows you the styles. But it seems like for the inputs they have these placeholders, and so, well, for the username, so I'm gonna be providing the placeholders. So placeholder username and placeholder password. And nice, I got placeholder for the username and password. And now our job here is to now style this button, move it towards the right side right here, and so that's what I'm going to do. So going back to login.css, we're going to be creating the login button class. We're going to make this display block. Give it a width of approximately 20%. And it seems like it has a little bit of padding between the left and right and top to bottom. And so let's say padding 2%. And then now, instead of centering, we're going to put it more towards the right side. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide the flow property and make it right. And so now I'm going to check to see if the styling has changed. Oh yeah, before I do that, I got to also import the classes into the button as well. So class name, classes dot login button. And nice, we got the button to style, and it looks a little too big, but we're going to change that. And as you can probably realize, the button is way too far to the right, and so we're going to provide some margin there so it shifts towards more this way. And so I'm going to make the width a little bit smaller. I'll say 15%. And then provide a margin right property. That's going to take 26% or 28%. Okay, Now it's a little bit better, but this button can be shifted more towards the right, so I'm just gonna lower it down a little bit, make it a little bit 24%, and boom. Now we got the login button to be perfectly aligned on this side with the inputs. And so now that all the styling is done, we can provide the functionality where we will be fetching an external API post call to Amazon AWS API link, which is provided right here. And if we were to provide the username Washington with the password 987, it should provide this as a result. And then it says that note CORS is enabled. If you're having problems with fetch, be sure you have a proxy set in package.json, otherwise use jQuery. And so in order to combat this problem, I'm going to be placing a proxy and set it inside the package.json. And so I'm going to copy this link, going to package.json, and I'll just put it right on the scripts. So proxy, just going to take a string, and now I'm just going to make the proxy equal to all the way until the end of .com. And so I'm going to place the comma right here, save it, and now since we set our proxy to this Amazon AWS API link, now if we were to go back to login and fetch it, we can just provide an additional routing so that it will fetch the data for us. And so before we do that, remember how we provide the onChange properties for the inputs so that it will call this onChange handler? Why don't we test it right now? So once we set state, we're going to console.log this.state, just so that we can test that the user inputs will change. And so if I were to go back, open my inspect element, change this to Ryan Shin, and then change this to password. And so now, as you can see, it changed it as we went by. And so that works just fine. So I can close this, go back, and now, since we changed the state, we're now able to collect all the form data and then fetch it. But in order to do that, we have to provide an onSubmit, so that once we click this login button right here, React will take the onSubmit JSX property and then provide some functionalities along with that. And so I'm going to provide an onSubmit handler. So this the onSubmit handler, which we haven't made yet, but we will get to that later. And also set this button type and make that equal to submit, so that it can, once we click this button, the form will be submitted. And so now we're going to create the onSubmit handler, which is going to take an event. And then now we're going to create a form data. And how we're going to create the form data is that we're going to use the states right here. But first and foremost, we got to make sure that we prevent the default of the event so that it doesn't refresh the page. And then create the form data. And have a username. Then take this this.state.username and password this.state.password. And we're just going to console.log the form data so that we could just see if it's pulling correctly. So if I were to go back, inspect the element. So now I'm going to say Johnny Woo and set the password to 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if I were to click this login button, it should console.log the form data. And perfect. We got the form data that we need right here. And so I'm just going to close this and go back. So that now that we're able to provide the form data, we're going to provide the fetch API. So fetch, and it's going to take, and if we go back to the API link, we set the proxy all the way to .com/. And so what we're going to do is provide the rest of it, which is, it's going to open this right here, all the way up to prod. Yes, we provide this. So we're going to say fetch from here. Make sure it includes the prod. And then we're going to say the method is a post. And then we're going to have to provide the body, which is, and we're going to have to stringify the form data. So json.stringify form data. And I forgot to create this into a string. So now it's going to be a post method, and it's going to create. And now what fetch does is that it provides the promise. And so what I'm going to do is make this into a response, and I'm going to call await. Whoops. Await. In order to use await, we're going to have to make this function into a asynchronous. So async await. And then it's going to provide an object. So what we're going to do is that we have to turn this into a JSON. And so const result is equal to await response.json. And then we're just going to console.log. Actually, if we were to go back, we should know what, actually, let me just go back to my email instructions. It should return an object that says success and user exists, and it provides a Boolean value of true and false. And so rather than just declaring this as a result, why don't we just destructure using ES6 syntax and call success and result. And then if success and, oh, not result, excuse me, user exists, which I think user exists, okay, and the user exists, and we're going to provide a ternary expression where it alerts the user that the login is successful. And then if not, alert the user login was not successful. Now if I were to save this and then provide the proper credentials, that username Washington and password 987 into the create React app, it should now alert us saying that the login was successful. So Washington password 987 and then log in, and it says unexpected token JSON at position. Okay, so seems like we got an error on submit handler. Asynchronous form data. Seems like got a syntax error and JSON position 0. since this is React 16, it doesn't make sense that I would have to bind this to onSubmit handlers. So let me just backtrack a little bit. And so just gonna comment this out. Console.log form data. So it shows up here. So const. So if I were to type in my name along with password, login, should log it just fine. So something was going wrong here. So if I do console.log response, I'm just going to type in a fake username and password. So it does log it here. Provides a 404 error saying it's not found. Perfect. That's what it's supposed to, and then provides a promise response. So that's fine. Say if I were to return that. That was really weird. Shouldn't have shown an error. So now if I were to give it a try, so Washington, password 987, click login. Didn't really do anything. Saying unexpected token at JSON. Oh, it's at login.css. Whoops, my mistake. So login.css. It's at 26. That is really weird. Just gotta make sure I wrote down the proper U. Oh, okay. AboveLine Junior test. This just seems really strange. Oh, wait a minute. It was test underscore service. Okay, so going back. So now it should work after it compiles. So if I were to go back to here, Washington, password 987, boom, it says login successful. All right, so that was my take and my walkthrough of the AboveLine Junior React Developer test. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach me out through email. And also, my repository for this challenge will be up on my GitHub, and it will be right in the description below. So thank you, and see you guys later.